Now, the High Classical period is going to be very important for the creation of this specific monument, for it is marked by, at the outset, moving the Delian treasury to Athens to pay for the very elaborate and very expensive series of structures on the Acropolis, and will last until the end of Athenian dominance when Sparta conquers them in the Peloponnesian War in 400 BCE. After the sack of Athens by Xerxes in the Persian War, we find that Athens will emerge first among equals to lead a coalition of Greek city-states in preparation for another Persian attack, which they feel is imminent. Now, this is going to require a war fund be set up, and the war chest itself being kept on the island of Delos. Hence, we have the creation of what is known as the Delian League. The Delian League, established and located on the island of Delos in 478 BCE, 2 years after the Persian War, is going to be a fund, and the Delian treasury is going to hold the communal funds of this league, where all of the Greek city-states put in for the war chest in order to pay for the training of soldiers, the creation of ships and armament, in preparation for the next attack. In 454 BCE, this treasury will be moved to Athens in order to showcase their dominance and their leadership position among the Delian League. The individual who would lead the Athenians and thus all of the Greek city-states in the Delian League is going to be none other than Pericles, the most famous statesman in the classical era. Now, Pericles is going to be the leader of Athens and dominated Athenian politics and culture, as well as the geopolitical ambitions of the Greeks at this time. He is elected strategos, or general of Athens, 15 times. And so he is going to be not only the political leader, but also the military leader of Athens. He will use the Delian League funds to build the Acropolis in one of the most brazen forms of embezzlement and white-collar crime of all antiquity. Now, this is going to establish, by way of the use of these funds, that Athens is going to be the head of and dominating an Athenian empire, that they are going to be in charge of all of the Greeks. According to Pliny the Elder, who writes in his Natural History that Chrysalis, the Greek sculptor in charge of creating the effigy for Pericles here, is going to make men appear even more noble and godlike than they were, hence a perfect high classical approach to art. We know that a bronze nude originally was set up on the Acropolis after Pericles' death in 429 BCE. Now, we only know what it looked like because of copies in the form of Hermes, or a bust on a square pillar, very popular with Romans as we see it here. He is still shown as a mature warrior with a helmet, and of course he would have been heroically nude. The original format would have been very much like the Riace warrior or the Doryphorus that we looked at last time, in which the maturity and experience is communicated by the beard of the face. But of course we note there are no lines or wrinkles or blemishes. He is mature, yet also perfect at the same time. And we would have expected the same type of perfection in his nude form as well. Now, the Acropolis is going to be built here in Athens, or we should say rebuilt, between 447 and 405 BCE. Pericles states clearly that, quote, "future generations will marvel us as the present age marvels us now," end quote, speaking that the monuments he is building here, the incredibly expensive monuments on the top of the highest hill in the city, would of course establish their legacy for all time. Now you find the Acropolis is not going to be only in Athens. Acropoli, plural, are in every Greek city, as we discussed. Acro meaning high, and Opolis meaning city. Literally, a high city is the highest point or part of a town where we always will find temples built so that the gods will always be seen anywhere in the surrounding city. Much like in ancient Sumeria and these Mesopotamian civilizations, they would elevate the temples on top of ziggurats in order to elevate them and be closer to the gods. Now, the Persians had destroyed the original Acropolis when they sacked Athens and burned it to the ground in 480 BCE. The Athenians had vowed to keep it in ruins as a memorial, as had Americans after the World Trade Center was bombed on September 11, 2001. But, just like New Yorkers who were convinced to rebuild eventually, so too did Pericles convince the rest of Athens that they should also rebuild in remembrance of those that were lost and of the war that was fought. Therefore, the Acropolis stands as a symbol for Athenian dominance and power, and that they lay claim as the sole victors in the Persian wars. Originally, we would have seen several gleaming white marble structures at the top of the highest point in the city. Not only would we have had a propylaea or gatehouse, an entryway to this holy precinct, but also the Parthenon and Erechtheion, a temple of Athena, Nike, and then we also were going to have a monumental statue of Athena overlooking the city to whom she gives her name. Now, the series of structures here are built in rapid succession, beginning with the Parthenon, showing us how important this commission and this structure was to the vision Pericles had and to Athenians in general. As in the other examples of temples we have looked at, note that there is a parapet or wall all the way around the precinct, and so we can only enter it from one angle, through the propylaea or the gatehouse. This ensures that we enter the precinct and view the buildings from the side, at an angle where we find the front and the side meet. Thus, of course, we must consider them as sculptural ensembles in and of themselves. Now, the first structure erected and the original temple to Athena Parthenos being destroyed by the Persians in 480 is going to be the base for this new lavish temple to the patron goddess of the city. Now, we find that Athena Parthenos, where the Parthenon gets its name, literally means Athena, the Virgin. And so we know that she is a virginal goddess who's also in charge of war and handicraft. Now, we know that Callicrates and Iktinos are the two architects that are called upon to design this larger temple with the existing foundations and stone elements in mind. So they built on top of the ruins of the old temple and expanded it. Now, one might ask why the temple survives in such poor shape today, and to that we would respond, it is in excellent condition considering what happened to it in the last several millennia. So, for instance, if we were to consider that in the Middle Ages, this is converted into a Byzantine church and then into a Roman Catholic church, requiring the destruction of parts of the cella or naos, and then a new structure or apse built inside of it. And then in the Ottoman Empire, when Muslims take over, they convert it into a mosque and add minarets. And then in 1687, the Venetians are going to besiege this area, and they blow out the interior that was being used at the time as an ammunition depot for gunpowder. Now, finally, we also have the Venetians and Lord Elgin removing statues from the pediments and from the interior over the course of its history. So it is amazing that it survives at all. Here is an image of it blowing up very famously, destroying the central section of it. You can still see the remnants of the minaret at the back of the temple. In addition, here we have an actual example of the Byzantine church that's built inside of the ruins at this time, right? Literally inside of the falling columns. Originally, we must remember that the finest white marble would have been used, and so a gleaming white display shimmering in the light as the sun rises and sets in Athens would have been a spectacular sight. Now, to show you how incredibly lavish and sumptuous this structure was, even the roof and tiles are going to be made of pure, expensive white marble. Usually, as we discussed with Temple of Heroon and earlier Greek temples, the roofs are made of terracotta tiles like most in the Mediterranean to this day. So in a reconstruction, we must imagine brightly painted or polychromed images of battles in the metopes, and then large life-size figures that are polychromed in the pediments on both sides, and then gleaming white marble all the way around this Doric order temple, which is the most severe, masculine, and serious order appropriate for the worship of the goddess of war. Now here we have the refined post and lintel system taken to the extreme, and here we have the most harmonious and mathematically balanced expression of this system. On the interior, as in every Greek and Roman temple to follow, there is a single cult statue of the god or goddess it is dedicated to. In this instance, because it is the Parthenon, we have an image of Athena Parthenos, sculpted by Phidias, one of the most celebrated sculptors of the day. So here, at 38 feet tall, we would have had a gleaming ivory statue of Athena, and also all of her clothing, and then the shield and armor that she wears, painted in gold, real gold, lavishing this huge statue, as she holds the goddess Nike in her hand. An amazing sight to be seen on the interior, but only priests and acolytes are allowed on the inside, as we mentioned. The harmony and balance of the structure, as with all Greek temples, is of course going to be considered mathematically. So the ratio here, being much larger than any temple that had been built before, is a 4:9 ratio, with breadth to length and column diameter to space between the columns here, and the algebraic formula equaling 2x plus 1 equals y, where x is the short side and y is the long side. So we have 8 columns. It's an octa-style temple on the front, and then 17 columns on the side. They're scaling it up by way of the ratios here. We began with a 1:2 ratio at Aegina that we discussed and move upwards. The deviations from regularity to create harmonious effect can be seen throughout the temple, in that it is algebraically and mathematically harmonious and correct, showing us the map of the cosmos. However, none of the two stones are exactly alike and interlocking. You can see that the columns still bulge outward in the center through entasis. We are going to be correcting this optical illusion or distortion, whereby if we're standing in front of a straight column, it will appear to sag. And so this corrects it visually. It is not, of course, mathematically and or harmoniously correct by way of straight lines. Instead, it looks correct. And that is the type of architectural contrapposto that the Greeks appreciate. So unlike the Doryphorus, which is going to be balancing the figure harmoniously with one leg and shifting the weight, now we have the architectural version of contrapposto, where it looks harmonious, but is not, right? It's not straight, just like the Doryphorus is not straight. Right here, we find that, like Polykleitos, Iktinos, one of the architects for the Parthenon, also writes a book on proportions, in this case relating architectural proportions to the harmony of the cosmos. Turning to the iconography and the symbolism of the Parthenon, we need to look very carefully at the types of battles and scenes chosen. First off, we find that Athena, dressed for battle attire here, is going to be holding Nike, the goddess of victory, in her hand, showing that Athena, and by extension the Athenians, are going to be victorious. On her sandals, we have illustrating a centauromachi and or a battle with the centaurs. On her shield, we have an amazonomachi and or a battle with the Amazons, the daughters of Ares, the god of war. In each one of these instances, we have important parts and roles played by famous Athenians from the past. Now, these struggles of men against gods and these overwhelming forces is related here to the struggle that the Athenians are going to face against the Persians, showing that like the battles with titans and giants and centaurs and Amazons, that the Athenian navy and the Athenian soldiers prevailed against overwhelming forces, overwhelming numbers. The Persians are going to have overwhelmed them and outnumbered them severely, yet they still won. Now, the exterior decoration of the Parthenon also includes many of these battles. And in 92 Doric metopes and a 524-foot-long Ionic frieze, we see how these battles are going to be related to the Athenians themselves and their victories, highlighting their accomplishments. In the metopes, which are going to be images on the entablature, in between the triglyphs painted blue, we have two figures for each one of these scenes locked in mortal combat between centauromachis, gigantomachis, and amazonomachis, or battles with a centaur, a giant, and an Amazon. In this example, we find a Lapith and a centaur engaged in combat in a centauromachi. Now, we remember that Theseus of Athens, who will become the first great king of Athens, plays a major role in one of these battles with the centaurs. And, of course, this is going to foretell the war against the Persians, where humans, mere mortals, fought against overwhelming forces, as though a man can once again fight a ferocious beast that is a half-horse, half-man hybrid, and still prevail. Now, unlike the early classical era, the austerity and severe style now gives way and is abandoned for much more active, riotous, violent action in a type of violent ballet. Now, the pose of the figure should remind you of the Zeus or Poseidon off the Cape Artemision, in that his arms are outstretched, and that's also going to be imitated in his legs, where he's pushing off from his back right leg in order to deliver the death blow. This being the most common way in which a centaur is shown who is going to be defeated by a man. You grab him by the back of his head, pulling him back, and then either stab him with a sword in the back of his head and or in his back, or once again bring a club down on his head. The head and arm and leg of this Lapith is missing, and so we do not know the exact weapon of choice, but we can recreate it by comparing it to other examples from the era. The balanced chiastic composition is going to be known from vase painting and now is going to be carried out on most of the metopes, where we find overlapping diagonals will form an X-shape or chiastic composition. Thus, we are going to suggest the potential for action, but it is always balanced. It is going to be counteracted by an opposing diagonal. So the chiastic or chiasmic composition seen here, or X-shaped composition, is going to provide us with the understanding that there is a total equilibrium, an athletic ballet occurring, in which we're going to follow the diagonal line from the left leg of the Lapith up through his right arm, and then the body of the centaur as the opposing diagonal. Thus we find that the centaur rears back, thus bringing us back to the left of the composition. And then, of course, the opposing force is the Lapith, who's going to be bringing the weapon back down to the center to the right. So they're coming together, even though they're pushing apart in the middle. Now we find that that is not the only area in which we have sculpture. We have sculptures fully in the round on the pediments, much like we looked at in the Trojan War scenes at Aegina at the Temple of Apphia. Now these freestanding sculptures would be secured at the top of the pediment, this triangular section, to the wall by metal pins. Each side is going to ensure that the figures shown are going to conform to the area of the pediment they are in. So if they're off to the sides, they're going to be kneeling and or closer to the ground. In this instance, we find Helios begins the scene by driving the chariot of the rising sun, showing us the day is beginning. Here is an example of it in place, whereby he moves past another god. The god could be either Dionysus or Heracles, depending upon what type of animal skin he is seated on. Because, of course, there is no difference between a god, a demigod, and a perfect Olympic mortal. The position of the body, we will note, is foreshortened and very relaxed. So we are activating multiple planes of space simultaneously here, whereby in the archaic era we would be restricted to a frontal or profile view. Next, we find that Demeter and Persephone, and or the goddess in charge of grain harvest, and her daughter, the goddess of spring, are going to hear the news that Athena has just been born from Iris. Iris, the messenger of goddesses, delivers female news, just as Hermes, or Mercury, delivers male news to the gods. She spreads the news of Athena's birth as she is born out of Zeus's brow, after, once again, Zeus had eaten her pregnant mother, Metis. She survived and is born the goddess of wisdom. Here is how Iris is often shown in art, and the ancient Greeks understood her as a rainbow. So anytime there was a rainbow in the sky, that is going to be indicative of a message being sent to a female, to a goddess. So here we have a recreation of these figures to show you how we would be moving up through the two goddesses to hear the message of Iris over to the other side where three other goddesses are going to be present, given that this is the celebration of the birth of one of the most important goddesses of the Olympians. We, of course, need to have all of the women present. So these could be Hestia, Dione, and Aphrodite. What we should note about these figures is that the drapery simultaneously covers and reveals the female form. So now we start to see the Greeks expressing an interest in the female body and showing us what is actually going to be underneath the dress. This leads to full nudity in the late classical era, but it takes a long time to get there for the ancient Greeks. Finally, at the end of the pediment, we have Selene, the moon goddess, bringing night with her tired, exhausted horses. The political and ideological message of everything we have looked at here at the Parthenon relates to the triumph of democratic Greek city-states over the imperialism of Persia. That, of course, democracy defeated imperialism, that Athens defeated Persia, and that the preeminence of Athens is thanks to the assistance of the goddess of war, Athena. To make this even clearer, the exterior wall of the cella, the interior room where the cult statue is kept, is decorated with a Panathenaic or all-Athenian festival procession that takes place every 4 years, much like the Olympics today. So every 4 years, the Athenians would weave a new wool peplous garment and carry it to the Acropolis to clothe a wooden cult statue of Athena that is now in the Erechtheion next to this structure. We discussed that a peplos is going to be a 4-part garment worn by a goddess and or her attendants. The procession, which leads through the entire city, begins at the Dipylon Gate, moves through the Agora, or the central square where public exchanges are going to take place, and ends finally in the most important religious center on the Acropolis. The representative types that we find in this relief frieze and procession are going to show the ideal inhabitants of this very successful city-state, beginning with a very lively riding out ceremony. Men are going to be shown much larger than they should be on horses, and they're going to be riding out from the city gates in order to meet the procession, in order to move us along to the Parthenon. Now we're departing again from correct proportions in order to make the men visible. Originally, these men would have been seen very brightly painted or polychromed, seen from a very low vantage point, so they are in higher relief at the top so we can actually view them. The bright colors making it easier to see that they are men and that they would alternate between white, black, and brown horses. Towards the end, they slow and begin interacting with one another. So the mortals are showcased here as ideal inhabitants to the city, and they are the active participants. At the very end, we find the gods, who are inactive, who are going to be watching this procession, not, again, taking place in it and or having any type of agency. So we find that the inactivity of the gods merely further highlights the activity and the importance of mortals. So here we have Aphrodite directing Eros. So we have gods pointing to the Athenians so that they are the primary focus of the composition and of the scene. So what we have here is this notion that the people are the city, that it is inseparable to actually discuss the Athenians from, again, the city-state. So we have the polis, this notion of the demos ruling, democracy. So in the classical era, this is the model. We find that we have a relief frieze with ideal types, shown in calm ennoblement, in rational architecture. This is the quintessential classical monument with classical decorations. Although the most famous structure on the Acropolis, the Parthenon, is not all that makes it up. We also have an entryway or propylaea, a picture gallery, the temple to Athena Nike, and the Erechtheion that we will discuss now. Now, entering into the precinct of the Acropolis or the high city would be through the propylaea, literally the gatehouse, where we find there is a porticoed entryway with a small temple to Athena Nike off to the right and a museum to the left. The temple portico is used here and for many cultures in the future as an entryway, just as we have in libraries, law courts, museums today. Off to the side, we have a picture gallery, which is the earliest known museum in history, which literally means the house of the muses. It inspires people. We have a gallery here of paintings for public view. Off to the side, we have the temple to Athena as goddess of victory and war, also known as the temple of Athena Nike. It is an Ionic temple that was destroyed by the Turks in the 17th century, and this is a rebuilt version of it, 27 by 19 feet. Here it is surrounded by a parapet or low wall that is decorated by panels of Athena presiding over celebrations with the winged Nikes or victory figures, women with wings that represent victory, and obviously Athena, being the goddess of military strategy on the Athenian side, wins battles. Here we have the very famous Nike adjusting her sandal from the temple of Athena Nike from around 410 to 405 BCE. It is relatively small, just under life size at 3 feet 6 inches as she bends over to adjust her sandal. Her chiton or dress slips off one of her shoulders, which of course is a passively seductive presentation of a female figure all the way through Western art. Now, Nike is going to not be a goddess in her own right with her own agency, but instead she is going to be the symbol of victory itself, the symbol of victory incarnate, and is used throughout Greek art by way of decorating warships to temples and so on. We know that inside the Parthenon, Athena holds a winged Nike as well. Now, the large overlapping wings seen here by Nike are going to balance out her pose, just as the chiastic positions did earlier on with the Lapithan centaur in the relief sculptures on the Parthenon, so that we have this notion of motion, but it is balanced, as her right leg is balanced out by her left arm, and the central vertical axis stabilizes this from her left leg up through her shoulder. Very similar in the type of balance that we saw in Myron's Discobolus, showing the same type of balanced motion as she is twisting. The drapery, of course, rhythmically drawing our eye in a circular fashion around her body. Now, this pivoting around a central axis ensures that we are balancing this implied motion that is so common in the high classical era and defines it. Now, the chiton, interestingly enough, clings to her body like wet silk, known as wet drapery. It is discreetly erotic because it does not, again, show nudity, nor is it overtly erotic, but instead, as seen in many of the sculptures here on the Temple to Athena Nike, we find that she is shown as revealing the female form, but not entirely. There still is a bit of propriety in the Greeks. We find that this is common and carried out throughout the decoration on the Acropolis, where we looked at the goddesses on the Pediment sculpture that also has this wet clinging drapery. So we are building up to full female nudity in the next era. Now, next to this and the Parthenon, we have a walled precinct with the Erechtheion, a very important structure for the Athenians, as it is a structure that has temples to and altars to several gods. Now, it was finished just before the defeat in the Peloponnesian War by Sparta, so it is one of the lucky structures here. It accommodates an uneven ground plan, so there are two porches, very unusual indeed. It is Ionic in its design, just like the Temple to Athena Nike, and houses the wooden image of Athena, Athena's olive tree, Poseidon's trident mark, and the original ruins of the archaic temple that existed before the Persians razed it to the ground, just like they had the Parthenon. It is dedicated to several deities, so not only do we worship Athena, but there are also altars to Poseidon and Hephaestus, or the god of the sea and the god of the forge. It houses the rock that still bears the marks of Poseidon's trident, for there was the contest noted between Poseidon and Athena, and because the Athenians are a maritime seafaring power, Poseidon is a very important god indeed. So they have a temple along with one dedicated to Athena next to it to ensure that the god of the sea is on their side. The altar to Poseidon is going to be the eponymous reason why this temple is called the Erechtheion, for the altar itself is called the Erechtheus. On the north porch, we would have housed the wooden cult statue of Athena, as mentioned during the Panathenaic festival, would have been reclothed in a peplos garment woven by Athenian women. The east porch is going to be made up of Ionic order columns and capitals that have spiral volutes, much like the Temple of Athena Nike, thus carrying through this design in these two different temples. The south porch is interesting because it is nicknamed the Porch of the Maidens and is going to show us the type of balanced regularity in the high classical era and also informs us of female statuary. Here we have 6 caryatids, or columns, that are carved to look like women. Male columns are called atlantids, or herms, as we discussed in ancient Egypt. The Doric capitals here that the columns or the caryatids represent will have an Ionic entablature above it with bands of carved molding. This is going to find precedence in structures like the Siphian treasury that also had caryatids, or these female figures that serve as columns in the front of this portico, holding out again items in each of their hands. Here we also are going to have the figures in contrapposto pose, with the 3 at the left with their right legs engaged or bearing the weight to hold up the structure, while the 3 at the right are going to show their left legs engaged. So this type of classical balance, closure, symmetry, and rhythm can be seen here literally in the contrapposto of each figure and how they balance out with one another, 3 on each side. Here we have a solemn, balanced contrapposto that still shows clothed women, yet we can still tell what is underneath their clothes now, given the protrusion of the fleshy forms as well as the legs. So we know that contrapposto is taking place and they are considering the musculoskeletal system. This, of course, is going to find an end with Athenian power with the Peloponnesian War, for the Athenians are going to press too hard in their regime, and the Spartans are going to resent them for it. Therefore, in this war, Sparta would win control of the mainland, while Athens still has their maritime empire and is going to remain a center of intellectual development and the place where we have the first academy founded. Next time, we will see the direction art will take due to this shift with the late classical era, where we begin humanizing the gods and showing fully nude women.